Trudeau, our prime minister, is a great example of that. So back, I think it was in 2015, he announced that half of his cabinet was going to be women because it was 2015 or some like muddle-headed virtue signaling excuse for not thinking. I think only 20% or 25% of the elected MPs were female. So the proper balance on average would have been 25% female, 75% male. What he should have done was figured out what qualities would make for a competent cabinet minister, because it's actually quite important to have competent cabinet ministers, and then selected from among his people for nothing other than competence. But he could virtue signal, and then he set up the most important board, let's say, of the entire country on a quasi-random basis. Jesus, how pathetic. He should have been pilloried by Canadians for that. But we're so clued out, and also in the situation that you described, is like, if I say, well, 50% of Trudeau's cabinet shouldn't have been women, it's like, oh, you're a misogynist. It's like, no, only 25% of the elected officials were women. Now, you might say, well, it would be better if 50% of them were elected. It's like, maybe it would be better, but it didn't happen. So you can't fix it at the top end. It was appalling. So it's a hard argument to make, because you need to know that there's more difference within groups than between them in order to be able to come up with a credible argument, And then, so, yeah, I think that the Trudeau government is far to the left of where people originally assumed it would be. I mean, I think that his decision to put 50% women in the cabinet was an abdication of responsibility of a magnitude that we haven't seen before in Canadian political history. Only 26% of the MPs elected were female. And that should have been approximately the proportion of cabinet members. But to say this is 2015 or whatever the hell the year was, and then to abdicate his responsibility for selecting the most competent people was an indication of exactly how, what would you say, how suited he is to be prime minister. And people just didn't make much of an issue of that because of their attempts to be tolerant. But I think that what he did was, I thought the fact that he ran to begin with was reprehensible because he ran entirely on the name brand recognition that he had derived from his father.
Yes.
And I think that that's the mark of someone who's narcissistic. Yeah. He shouldn't have done that. Or
it worked, though. A lot of immigrants voted for him. My dad voted for him.
He's very charismatic and attractive, and he knows how to behave in public. And he had a very, very famous name. But I believe that it was immoral of him to run because we're not dynasties. Democracies aren't dynasties. And he hadn't the CV, the record of success that you would need as an independent individual to justify himself as a qualified candidate for prime minister. So I thought that his candidacy right from the start was ethically flawed. But then to multiply that error with these shallow attempts at broadcasting tolerance, especially at the expense of competence and the capacity to truly evaluate, is just inexcusable. Look, it's unbelievably widespread. So I'll give you an example that's very similar. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced in 2015 that half the cabinet that he put together would be women, despite the fact that only approximately, I think it was 20 to 25% of the elected officials were female. And so what he basically admitted, as far as I'm concerned, was two things. Number one, he was incapable of judging people on their competence. Because when you put together something like the cabinet for a country, what you do is you find the most competent people, period. Because it's so bizarre that it even has to be said, because it actually turns out that the cabinet is important. And so to me, all he did was default on his central moral obligation to screen every single one of his members of parliament with exceeding care and to pick the most qualified people. And his rationale was that it was 2015. To reduce competence to racial, ethnic, gender identity, something like that, is an absolutely appalling move philosophically as well, as far as I'm concerned, to assume that diversity is somehow represented by group membership. There's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, the scientific evidence suggests quite the contrary, which is that there's more variability within groups than there is between groups, which is actually an antidote to the central racist claim, right? Because the central racist claim is there's more difference between groups than there is difference within them. And so, you know, you've seen one black person, you've seen them all.
Pretty luck. People who've already done that.
So okay, that's interesting. So you're saying it's a necessary transition. You're saying there's something about the life...
Jesus, I'm saying something simple. If you can't make your damn bed, quit waving placards at corporations. It's like, Jesus, it's like... seriously, man, it's like, what the hell? What makes you can't get this tiny little part of the world that's actually right at your feet, functional. You have contempt for it. It's just my bedroom.
That seems like gratuitous caricature of people. I mean, look,
it's not gratuitous.
Well, their flip on that is, look, why should I waste my time making my bed when we've got to deal with these problems in the world? You know,
because you risk inflating your own ego by dealing with the problems of the world. So, it's like it's the cathedral problem again. It's like, oh, I should be at the center of the universe.
Right. So
it's like, yeah, well, maybe not.
I'm trying to find a resolution of this that goes beyond the existing cultural conflict around it. Because no doubt people need to attend to their own projection and their own limitations and have humility and some psychological insight and work harder on what they're directly responsible for. I don't doubt that. But I am concerned with a message that says that's all you should be doing, and until you figure that out, don't do anything else.
No, I'm not saying that's all you should be doing.
But you're saying you have to do it first.
Before you can do that, you should be very leery of assuming that when you try to do something else, you won't just make it worse. And you will. Look, I've dealt with people who've dealt with complex systems for a very long period of time. And I know the difference between someone who can make a complex system better and someone who will make a complex system worse. And most people will make a complex system worse.
Okay.
That's for sure.
So that's... Okay, that's good, because that's coming to the question of development and the question of human maturation and the question of what it means to unfold throughout the lifespan. So just to try and distill that last point, you're sort of saying don't begin and end with your own responsibility of cleaning your room and sorting your personal and immediate affairs out, but realize that until you can do that, you may be lacking certain forms of competence that might make you doubt whether you should be quite so visceral and adamant about your political views.
Precisely that, yes, and it's exactly the opposite of what students are taught in universities.
But you're not saying don't care about those things or don't act on them, but just while you're doing them, attend to your own limitations and competencies.
Well, I'm saying you should be aware of your own competence and your limits, and that's especially true if you're very young, because like, what the hell do you know? You haven't done anything. You're like, I tell 18-year-olds, 6 years ago you were 12. It's like, what the hell do you know? You haven't. You're under the care of your family or the state. You haven't established an independent existence. You haven't had children. You haven't started a business. You haven't taken responsibility for anything. You don't have a degree. You haven't finished your courses. You don't know how to read. You can't think. You can't speak. You're ill-kempt. You don't know how to present yourself. Well, Jesus, you know, and it's just not right to tell people in that situation that they should go out and change the socioeconomic structure of the culture.
What those children or young people observe are not wise adults managing complex systems adeptly. They see people giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies. They see people
they see activists teaching them at university who are no smarter than they are. Jordan, and they think, well, I can do that.
You're so hung up on the university experience. We keep coming back to this issue of the activists at the university, which is clearly very salient for you. But for those who are not there, it's frankly alienating. Because your other work is so fantastic, but it keeps coming back to this narrative of these slightly callow students who are maybe a bit over-enthusiastic about a political issue.
Well, I'm more concerned with their professors than with the students.
Okay, also the professors
supporting them. And I'm concerned about the professors because they've completely corrupted the humanities. And the humanities are the core of the university. And by corrupting the humanities, they're corrupting the fundamental structure of our civilization. And they're spreading that out into the general culture. And there's no excuse for that.
They may be doing that, but simultaneously others are corrupting the ecological foundations, the social foundations. Democracy is arguably dying. There are real problems that are existential threats at a different level.
There's a whole large variety of existential
And I don't think that's happening principally because some people are being taught feminist theory in the University of Toronto. It's not that. It's something else, much bigger and broader and deeper, that when people raise these issues, you focus on that small issue, not the big ones that they're worried about.
Well, it depends on the issue, I suppose. I would say that
climate change, for example, just for argument's sake.
Well, what should I say about climate change?
Well, what should you do?
Did you drive here?
No, I didn't.
What did you do? How did you get here?
I took public transport.
Okay, well, you know.
But that's not really. But again, that's hardly the point. I mean,
well, no, it is the point. Well, it is the point because it's part of the problem with climate change is irreducible complexity.
Right.
It's like you know there's a cost to our existence, and the cost is externalization.
Yeah.
Right, externalization of costs, and we don't know how to manage that.
Right.
And I would say, should we be concerned about it? It's like, yeah, absolutely. Do we know how to be concerned about it? Not really.
Not really, right. So then how do we learn? That becomes the question, right? So the younger generation who are
I
likely
can give
to
you
be
an example.
more directly affected, the kinds of people in developing countries and younger people who feel the pinch of this all the more because they can see, for example, New York, the chance of it being underwater by the end of the century is not negligible. And therefore, they're looking for a response that really matters to them. And when you think about responsibility,
that's
they think,
easy. That's easy.
No, but their view is, don't patronize me about my bedroom when I've got the planet to save.
I'm not patronizing you. I think
no,
your
not me.
bedroom is
I'm
important.
just saying that there is a
I know.
There is a voice.
No, I understand. I think your bedroom is important.
Right. No, I mean, they
no,
might
but I
too,
seriously
but they think the
that.
whole planet is more important. They're more concerned about that. And why is that
your
wrong?
bedroom is a microcosm of the planet.
Right. Well, tell us about that then.
Well, let's go back to the climate issue here first, because there's this guy that I'm aware of. His name is Boyan Slat, and I'm going to talk to him in the relatively near future, I think. And he's a model for young people. He went out scuba diving when he was 17, and there was a lot of plastic, and that sort of bothered him. And then he started thinking about manta rays and how they move through the water, and then he noticed that most of the plastic was in the top 6 inches, and then he thought, I wonder if I could build a machine that was like a manta ray that would float on top of the water. And anyways, to make a long story short, he's devised a way to rid 50% of the plastic in the world's oceans within 5 years, and has spent the last 6 years developing that and is well on the way to implementing it, and it looks like it might work, and he's going to be able to make a profit from it, just to add that extra bit of punch. Yeah. And so Boyan Slat, I would say, it's like, I don't know if his room was clean or not, but there was something about him that was dead on, because when he looked at a problem like that, he thought, I'm not going to go out there and tell a bunch of other people what they're doing wrong so that they can solve it. I'm going to bloody well fix it. And that's what I'm telling young men in particular to do. Although, if young women want to do that, it's like, great, more power to them. But people say, well, I'm taking climate change seriously. I'm going out to protests. Like, you're not taking it seriously. That's not serious. Serious is you're going to devote 80 hours of your life to it for the rest of your life, right? You're going to work on that so intently that you're not even going to think about anything else. Like,